Hey everybody, how's it going? Sure? It is going? Yeah. Yeah. You can't stop it. Even when you do nothing, it keeps going. No, it keeps going even then. Just maybe not for you. So we're moving into a different figure, although it might be kind of hard to tell based on especially the stuff we get in chapters 1 through 5. Different figure now, looking at John Locke, our old friend John Locke, one of two people that we're going to be reading twice in this class. We already looked at Thomas Hobbes on these questions of politics, and Hobbes gave us a story. Somebody give me, really quickly, as quickly as you can, what's the story that Hobbes is telling about how it is that we come to have civil governments, and where does their authority come from? Yeah, sure, Corbin.
We start in the state of nature.
We start in the state of nature.
Where everything sucks and everyone tries to kill and steal from each other.
Sounds good so far. It sounds bad so far, but that's what Hobbes is saying, right? Okay.
And then enough people decide that, hey, I don't want to get killed or have my stuff stolen.
And it's maybe even not only enough people decide. The way that Hobbes casts it is that according to these laws of nature, 19 different laws of nature, we are rationally compelled to make this decision. Yeah, so what's the decision?
We make the decision to give up our right to everything in order to have some level of peace and understanding between people.
Give up our right to we don't give. So be careful here with the phrasing, because I'm pretty sure you mean the right thing, but let's make sure that the phrasing isn't the sort of thing that can be misconstrued. When we say we give up our right to everything, we're not saying we give up all of our rights. We're saying in the state of nature we have relatively unlimited liberty, or unlimited liberty with an asterisk, small print, conditions may apply. And for Hobbes, somebody tell me, and not necessarily Corbin, in fact, definitely not, necessarily not Corbin, why the asterisks on unlimited liberty? Can I not do anything I want? Adam.
Because everybody else is constantly infringing on that limitless liberty.
Right, so everybody else has that limitless liberty as well, and also there are just going to be things that maybe I want to do but I can't. I want to jump over the mountain. And it's you don't have infinite liberty there. Natural law, maybe in the sense of scientific natural law, constrains me. And perhaps we'll see the same sort of thing is going other sorts of ideas that get right at what Adam was saying, is that other people are trying to do stuff as well. So at least when I say I have unlimited liberty in the state of nature, I have unlimited liberty to try to do whatever I want. I may or may not succeed. And we decide that we want to all come together and lay down some of our liberty, consolidate some of our liberty, so that we can live according to laws. Is this a good idea in the state of nature? To say I'm gonna lay down some of my liberty, and everybody else is gonna agree to. Why should I believe them? I've made a contract, but can't they just break the contract? There has to be a power to enforce the contract, and this is the heart and soul of the Hobbesian account here. Is that first of all, the state of nature is awful. Second of all, in order to get out of the state of nature, which seems like we're rationally compelled to do, we have to be able to trust everybody else. And it is, in large part, Hobbes gives us a whole cluster of things that drive us out of the state of nature. Fear is one of them, hope's another one, desire for things is yet another one, and rationality plays a fairly substantial role as far as Hobbes is concerned. But the flavor of this, I don't know if you guys come away from reading Hobbes like this, the fear part is doing a lot of work. And this is why the thing that has to enforce contracts, otherwise they don't even make sense to try to make. So we're saying the laws of nature dictate that we're going to try to get out of the state of nature, and the only way that we can do that is by creating this sovereign authority. That is, perhaps in following with this kind of fear-based story that Hobbes is telling, that sovereign has to be crazy scary. It has to be it has to awe people into submission. It has to be more powerful than the most powerful bad actors, even if they were to gang up. It has to be the sort of thing that nobody could possibly challenge. Otherwise, what good is making any kind of compact and then there's no way to climb our way out of the state of nature? We'd be trying to like lobsters trying to crawl out of like a container, right? They're just like pulling each other down as they're like each one's trying to climb out, and in the process you're pulling everybody else who's trying to climb out down, and they're trying to pull you down. Have you seen, I'm pretty sure this is staged, but have you seen this Japanese game show where they're trying to like climb up the Vaseline stairs? Which is hilarious, but it's like this is a pretty good demonstration, like an illustration, a funny demonstration of like what is a very serious kind of scenario of the state of nature, which is everybody's trying to get what they want, but they can't because they're all kind of getting in each other's way and pulling each other down. And in order to do this, we have to create some sort of sovereign political authority, and then we can enter into not the state of nature, but into like a civil state. John Locke is telling a very similar story. You can even tell by the outline of the chapters we're going to be talking about today. There's a discussion of political power. That wasn't off limits for what Hobbes was talking about. There's some stuff about the state of nature. There's going to be a social contract that we all have to make in order to get out of the state of nature and enter into a civil government. So the big trick, I would say, not just for reading John Locke, but reading Hobbes, Locke, and our next author that we're going to encounter, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, reading these guys together, who's also going to tell a very similar story. It's going to involve a state of nature, and we're going to try to get out of the state of nature by making a social contract. This is the title of Rousseau's essay, The Social Contract. So a lot of similar themes. And the trick to reading these folks, and I think understanding them, is figuring out what the subtle differences between the Hobbesian account, the Lockean account, and the Rousseauian account are going to be. What are these like tiny little places? Because the broad strokes of their accounts are very similar. They use the same sorts of conceptual tools. So where is it that Locke is going to zag where Hobbes zigged, right? Or Rousseau is going to go yet another different one. Like, I don't know, what's the third thing besides zigging and zagging? What's that? Yeah, going straight. Yeah, one zigs, one zags, one goes straight. Okay, and I'll let you decide which one is doing which. Let's say Rousseau goes to the left, Hobbes goes to the right, Locke maybe goes right down the middle, according to kind of like our general political sensibilities of left, right, and center, perhaps. I don't know if that's entirely true. We can read Locke a bunch of different ways. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe that's not a bad way of portraying this. How did you guys find this when you were reading chapters 1 through 5 of Locke's second treatise on government? Were you remarking on this? Were you like, this sounds just like Hobbes? Just like Hobbes? Or you finding places where you're like, ooh, that's different. That's not Hobbes. There's at least one thing that I'm going to try to introduce this idea today, and it's going to be awfully helpful because I don't know if you guys noticed, a reflection draft has been posted, and it's due Friday at midnight, as we usually do these sorts of things. And this is asking you to put, yeah? While I'm talking, I'm going to fix that right now. That was clearly not the intention. So what was I saying? Oh, right. That reflection draft is asking you to put Hobbes and Locke into conversation with one another. And I even drop a little hint about what the difference between them is, especially regarding the state of nature. I want you to kind of talk about, like, what are the differences between their different accounts, between their two accounts of the state of nature. And once we figure that out, tell me... Done. Once we figure that out, tell me, like, who's got the better account and why? Right? This is kind of like a classic philosophical argumentative structure. Give me the argument one way, give me the argument the other way, explain how they're different, and then give me a third argument that tells me which of those two arguments is better and why. Yeah, Adam.
I was just going to say, it seems that...
You've got a clue for what the big difference is?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that John Locke's state of nature is a little more endearing. Like, it suggests that humans are inclined to do good for others because it means that they will be done good.
But didn't Hobbes say a similar sort of thing? Like, do good for others? In fact, he kind of summarized his laws of nature with a golden rule. I remarked, I don't know if you guys were picking this up, because I didn't get a whole lot of feedback when I said this, that Hobbes' golden rule is not quite the golden rule that I grew up with. It's a don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do unto you. But it seems like it's this, don't hurt other people. This is like part of how we get out of the state of nature. And Locke is saying a similar sort of thing?
Yeah, but even more so that by doing, I'd say it's closer to the golden rule.
It's a little closer to the golden rule?
You want to do specifically good for others.
Yeah. This is an elusive sort of thing, and I would definitely agree, and maybe you guys can chime in on this as well. Did you also feel Locke had a somewhat sunnier portrayal of what the state of nature was like?
Humans use more reason.
Humans use more reason?
More so reason than they just want to kill each other, like Hobbes said.
Well, but Hobbes says we all have reason, and this accounts for the laws of nature, and this is what drives us inevitably out of the state of nature. And this is why it's never a good idea to commit regicide. Right, to chop off King James I's head, because that will bring us back into the state of nature, right? It is never going to be a good idea, because we have reason. So yeah, like, careful with the caricatures here. Like, those caricatures are going to be helpful sorts of lenses that are going to kind of like enable you to distinguish Locke from Hobbes. But don't paint Hobbes out to be like some cartoonish sort of authoritarian figure. He's enough of an authoritarian figure without cartooning him. And let's not make Locke out to be like some kind of like perfect guy either. Like, oh, Locke's got all the answers. There are going to be some issues here with Locke as well. The two are closer than they might seem. As a matter of fact, like I would say, like I go back and forth from semester to semester when I teach this class. Sometimes I'm just like, oh, they couldn't be clearer. And sometimes I'm like, oh, geez, what the heck is the difference between Locke and Hobbes? Except for like a couple of little bits of emphasis here and there. Well, I'm going to try to draw our attention today to one difference. There's going to be like one big difference there too, this role of property for Locke. Try to draw our attention to one big difference that's kind of hard to deny. It's not just a matter of like flavor or mood or anything as kind of ephemeral as that. There are some bits of Locke's argument that are definitely very different than Hobbes, and we can see how they arrive at different conclusions. They definitely do arrive at different conclusions, by the way, and I suspect that a lot of the folks who were a bit exasperated in our last meeting about Hobbes, specifically with questions of like monarchy and whether monarchy seems like a good idea, and Hobbes thinks like monarchy is totally fab. This is like the great way to like this is the best way to make a commonwealth. This is the best kind of sovereign to have. And perhaps this is because his idea of the sovereign is something that like has to be so intimidating that you wouldn't even think about coming up against it. And this is how he gets to like his royalist positions with respect to the English Civil War. So maybe that's one difference. And you have to read a little further than we've gotten here so far in chapters 1 through 5. Did anybody have any sense of John Locke's attitude towards monarchy? Okay. Well, then let's let it be a surprise. He's not a big fan of it. And he's a much bigger fan of democracy, right? And perhaps this is just, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Hobbes as well. Maybe the account up till that point when he's talking about like why monarchy is better than the other forms of government. Maybe that is the sort of thing that can be bought into, and Hobbes just kind of jumps off track or like takes a different direction than we would be inclined to make on types of government. And we don't necessarily have to lump it all together. But I think we can get a sense here with John Locke, too, that we can figure out where it is that difference in conclusion comes from by keeping very, very careful track of how he's laying the groundwork in these early chapters. Hobbes was writing Leviathan, came out in 1651, and I remarked that 1651 was a banner year for England on account of the king lost his head. There was a civil war, and it ended quite badly for the royalists. John Locke writes his second treatise on civil government in 1689, or comes out in 1689. Also, John Locke was busy in 1689. 1689 to 90 was when his essay concerning human understanding also came out, so if you're ever kind of thinking to yourself like, I have like too many papers to write, John Locke wrote to like 2 totally kick-ass like canonical works of Western philosophy in the same year. This is maybe something for all of us to think about. Like, I don't have time to write. Oh, John Locke. Maybe we shouldn't compare ourselves to John Locke. But either way, 1689, big year in English history as well. Anybody know what happened in 1688 in England? 1651 is the English Civil War. 1688, it's another civil war. So in 1651, the king loses his head. I believe it's his brother. Last time did I say James II was James I's son? I think actually it's his brother. Somebody look this up for me, like on your kind of pocket computer. he gets banished to France, and I even remarked that this is Mary Wollstonecraft went with him, or went with the wife of King James I to France. All the royalists who were banished. Oliver Cromwell comes in with his parliamentarians, the Roundheads. Oliver Cromwell is named the Protectorate of the Commonwealth. He lasts for a little while, and then James II comes back in. But immediately starts making trouble again. Everybody's really kind of grumpy and upset. James II is really overreaching with his authority. And we have yet more kind of Protestant versus Catholic sort of stuff that's dusting up. And in England, there's very little patience for those kinds of wars. And so he's gotten rid of as well. Not quite as violent as the last one. He doesn't lose his head. He just runs away. Maybe a success. I don't know. Does that count as a civil war? If there's just kind of some menacing and then the king runs off? I might call it a coup, although there might be something to the idea that if James II leaves, he is, in fact, as Hobbes was saying, you can't switch sovereigns without the permission of the current sovereign. Maybe we've satisfied that. In the Glorious Revolution. It's called the Glorious Revolution. Any winner of a revolution is going to call their revolution glorious. But the Glorious Revolution is a relatively bloodless revolution. I don't think that's entirely true on account of, there must have been some scuffles where somebody at least got a bloody nose. I'm sure some people even got killed. But the king isn't killed. He just runs away. And he's replaced with another monarch, and perhaps in a very kind of surprising turn, a monarch not from England. They import a monarch from the Netherlands, William of Orange. William and Mary, you might know William and Mary, there's a college here in the United States called William and Mary. That's the William. And we get just a completely different line of kings after the Glorious Revolution. And John Locke states pretty explicitly in the early passages of his second treatise on government that he's a fan of this. He thinks that this was a great thing that happened, and he's very happy about it, and he intends to lay down some principles here that explain why it was good that it turned out that way, why this was a legitimate change of power. So yet again, political sorts of goings-on in the background in England are not just creating some kind of background for the political philosophy that's being done, but are, I think, significantly informing the political philosophy that's going on. That's probably enough in the way of setting the stage. Let's get down to brass tacks, because these three there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Yeah, there's pretty interesting stuff. Oh, let's just do it all. Chapter 1, in which he lays out his goals for this, we get some indication that the first treatise on civil government, which was not assigned to you, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if you didn't read it. Very few people do, except for folks who are really studying Locke. It's that second treatise that's kind of the really big one. That first treatise is concerned mostly with this question of succession of right to rule. And there's even some other materials that he had written for the second treatise on government that don't end up making it into the final version, that Locke makes some reference to, and he says, these didn't get included, these aren't here, but just to kind of give you some background of what was on my mind at the time, is he's arguing directly against, what's the guy's name? Is it Robert Filmer? Did you guys read this? Did you take the quiz? You just read the parts that the quiz was about? Is this what the quiz does? Is you look for the answer to the quiz and you don't read anything else?
I was planning on reading more of it, but I didn't have.
Ran out of time. Yeah. John Locke wrote 2 big essays in the same year. I don't know if that's true. He did some other stuff as well. But anyway, and it was a big year. I sometimes am I can't do any work. I'm busy trying to figure out what's going on politically in my own country. Locke, shit was crazy in 1689 in England. All right. Sir Robert Filmer, who's making arguments about divine right of succession. And this is the sort of thing that, John Locke seems clearly uninterested in. That how you determine who the next king is after the old king is some kind of, perhaps a, well, the right of rule was perhaps considered by Filmer, not perhaps, definitely considered by Filmer to be a divine right of rule, and it gets passed from father to son. This is how, like, the divine right of succession was portrayed by Filmer. By the time the second treatise on government has come out, Filmer's dead, and John Locke even says, like, it seems a little bit unfair for me to, like, make arguments against a dead guy, and maybe this is a big part of the reason why he doesn't even include this in the second treatise, but he remarks that lots of people are starting to talk like this again. There are little bubblings of kind of not just royalists, but also this idea that, like, the proper order of succession is explainable by divine right and inheritance from father to son. And Locke is like, no, this is not going to be okay. So this creates a little bit of background, and you'll see it in, like, little flashes throughout the second treatise. You'll see these moments where you can tell that, like, he's arguing to that sort of sensibility, arguing against that sort of sensibility, that divine right of succession is how we determine who should lead. So he mentions that in chapter 1 a little bit just to kind of, like, set what his broader goals are, what's on his mind when he's writing this, and then he immediately launches into a discussion of political power. Actually, before we get into this discussion of political power, John Locke asks an interesting question that I'd like to start our discussion here today off with. It's this question of whether or not the civil societies that we live in are an indication that we're any different or any better, really. Any better. Are we any better than mere beasts? And sometimes we like to think that because we live in civil societies rather than, like, out in the wild like the mere beasts do, then this is perhaps what makes us better. We're civilized, unlike the beasts of the wild, and this makes us better. But Hobbes even mentioned this. There are plenty of beasts that seem to have political lives, or something kind of like political lives. Bees have political lives. Ants have political lives. Monkeys seem to have political lives as well, yeah. There does seem to be some kind of hierarchy, some sort of order. If you look at the way that, like, bees do it, it's highly regimented as well. So this is kind of like this kind of question that hangs, and maybe we can read this against the mood of Hobbes' Leviathan as well, where, like, Hobbes definitely seems to indicate that there's something about us that's different than the rest of the beasts. Perhaps it has something to do with reason, which is the thing that every philosopher is going to say that makes humans different than all other non-human animals. But reason, I don't know, reason makes us different, doesn't make us better. This is like a tricky word. It's going to make us better. Somehow more noble, more dignified in the kinds of civil societies that we live in? Yes?
Would it be superior? Would that be?
Superior, yeah, but again, like this, there's a question in, like, what kind of superiority would we mean? Or, like, does that superiority obtain at all, and from whence does it come, and what do we mean by that superiority?
It's like to make the ease of our lives, like to make our lives easier. We're able to do it better in a higher rate than they are.
So we get to have better lives, and that's what makes us superior?
Make it easier on us.
Yeah, Pearson?
Reason is something that distinguishes us from animals, but, like, at the same time, I'm immediately worried where this goes with people with misunderstanding.
Right, so yeah, so
They can hardly reason, but I mean, I would not be comfortable saying, like, oh, they're misunderstanding.
that they would then therefore just be like the mere beasts, right? And maybe this also, I've got, like, environmental ethics stuff on the mind right now as well, and we're in a kind of, like, rights and welfare and, like, moral responsibilities to non-human animals unit right now. But one of the things we might ask here is, like, is that such a bad comparison, and what makes us think that we're better than the mere beasts in the first place? What makes us think, perhaps then, I'm sorry, what was your name? The guy who said superiority. Massey. Massey suggested superiority, but maybe that superiority is just an ability to dominate non-human animals. But I don't know if that gives us the right to dominate those non-human animals, right? So are we any better than the mere beasts? Is there something more noble? If what drives us into and keeps us in a civil society is just fear. Fear because without the authority of the Leviathan to keep us in line, we'll just be at each other's throats. Man, I don't know if that's an interesting sort of superiority. It is a pretty vague question, but I think this is maybe a fruitfully vague question, because the ways that we're, like, even in trying to answer it, we end up exploring some really interesting places. Locke makes it quite explicit. He says, "Are we only civil because of fear and threats? Do we have to be threatened into acting civil? Or is there something maybe more positive that draws us?" This might be a key to, like, trying to figure out if Locke doesn't just seem a little bit sunnier than Hobbes, but there is actually a more optimistic account of human nature going on in Locke than in Hobbes. I would argue that we're going to kind of take a step in like a even further direction with Rousseau, beyond where Locke is going to end up here. But, like, keep an eye on this. If we don't get to it by the end of today, and we still have time, remind me, we'll come back to this question. And if we don't have time, we'll open with it at our next meeting. What is it that, like, Locke is saying about human nature that's kind of going on in the background of the account that he's giving? Yeah, Pearson.
Yeah, think about it. You do the simple things like trade. Like someone that's caught someone's fish and then trade with one another. You don't have to do everything yourself, which is why society kind of works, because you do things for one another. It's much easier for one person to do one thing, one person to do another, and then trade among them.
Yeah, this is getting warmer, right? This is not a sort of cooperation that's kind of like a mutual agreement to not harm one another. There's something about, like, a positive sort of cooperation so that we can create bigger and better things for ourselves. That might be the one little hang-up that makes Locke a little bit different than Rousseau, because it's going to be motivated from self-interest, but it's not going to be kind of like a fearful self-interest. It's not going to be to protect myself from others. It's going to be this idea that, like, in being able to cooperate with others, I'm able to make my life better. Adam, was that just how you were sitting? All right. So one way that we might think about this question of, like, are we any better or, like, than the mere beasts, or are we only civil because of fear and threats, is to immediately get into this question of power, specifically political power. We want to figure out what is political power, because if it's just the ability to intimidate others, it seems like the answer to this question is, like, probably yes, or at least close to yes. If all that political power is an ability to threaten, then maybe we're only civil because of fear and threats. So what is political power? That was not a rhetorical question. That was an actual earnest question. What is political power? I'll give you a hint. It's in chapter 1 of the second treatise, and Locke begins the sentence with, political power is, yeah.
It's the power to make laws over...
I'm going to insert one, because the laws part is definitely a big part of it. But Locke says, and in fact, we even get it bolded in our text, it is a right to make laws. Ah, that's interesting. A right to make laws, including prescriptions of, like, penalties for breaking those laws, including, and Locke kind of tips his hand here, this is going to be a running theme through our analysis, especially when we start looking at war, slavery, and property. Life, liberty, and property, right? The preservation of life, just in case you're wondering. War is about life. Slavery is about liberty. And property is, perhaps unsurprisingly, about property. It's the right to make laws, including penalties for breaking laws. And what's the most intense penalty that you could possibly imagine? The death penalty, yeah. Including death. So it's the right to make laws, including death. So it's not just the power to enforce your will. It's not just the power to, like, kill those who stand in your way. There are all kinds of power Locke points out. In fact, he even discriminates. He says, like, we want to specify political power because there are all other kinds of power. There's parental power. That's going to get some discussion in our next meeting when we start talking about whether or not the family unit is a reasonable sort of an analog for civil society. But that's a different kind of power. It's not quite the same as political power. It's not quite the same as the power that's active in a civil society. So it is the right to make laws, not just the ability to make laws, but the right to make laws. And this includes the death penalty, but only insofar as perhaps it's consistent with the law, right? You can't just go killing people because they get on your nerves. This political power, by the way, notice that at this point in the discussion, Locke is not making any kind of discriminations between political power as it exists in the state of nature or political power as it exists in civil society. He talks about this before he even introduces the idea of the state of nature in this essay. So we might think of this as something that's not restrained to like one or the other context. This is a definition of political power that works in any kind of situation. So the right to make laws, including the death penalty. I bet you weren't done. Were you, Corbin? Was there more to this?
No, there's more.
There is more.
It's escaping me right now.
That's okay. You did a pretty good job getting us started. Right to make laws, including the death penalty. Anything else? Yeah, it's to employ the force of the community. I'm going to not put that on because I'm running out of space, and there are two other things that I definitely want to get on the board. But yeah, that's definitely one of them. It's the ability to employ the community to help enforce the laws. But yes, the right to make laws, including the death penalty. And what are those laws aimed at? Say it again for me.
Regulating and preserving property.
For regulating and preserving property.
And defending the Commonwealth and external attack.
Yep, that's another one that is totally correct and important, but not important enough to like make it on the board with the precious space resources that we have. So yeah, missing from here is this idea of protecting us from external attack, which is definitely on the map here for Locke, but he doesn't focus as much on it. As a matter of fact, we'll note that defending against external attack is outside of the context of civil government. It's something that civil government does, but the external attack doesn't, it's external to the civil society, right? And Locke and Hobbes alike. In fact, almost all social contract theoreticians are going to say these sorts of disputes between countries, between sovereign nations, are going to be the sorts of things that really just properly belong in the state of nature, unless there's some third party to appeal to, some sort of like international government body that's able to enforce laws. So regulating and preserving property. We don't get life, liberty, and property here just yet, just regulating and preserving property, although the three are going to all be tangled up with one another. So if we get property, maybe we got life and liberty as well. Yeah, there we go. In fact, I'm going to put that one in a different color. All for the public good. And not only am I going to put it in a different color, I'm going to underline it twice, and then I'm going to circle it in green, and then I'm going to circle it in red, and then I'm going to put a little stars on like either end. This is important, is my point. All for the public good. Because it puts a condition on political power. Right? It says the whole point of this is to regulate and preserve property all for the public good. As soon as that public good isn't being served by political power, that political power ceases to be a right to make laws, right? It no longer has that right. This is huge. And this is where a big difference between Locke and Hobbes enters in. This is like one of the major like zags where the other one zigs. This is all for the public good. Good here so far? Bit of a rough transition from this to the state of nature. But why not? Let's get into it. So from here we got a treatment of the state of nature. And the state of nature is, much like Hobbes describes it, for Locke, it's a kind of an unlimited liberty. And again, the unlimited liberty has an asterisk. As a matter of fact, the way that Locke says this, he says it's not unlimited license. It's not just the right to do whatever you feel like. There's an unlimited liberty with an asterisk, and the constraint on this liberty, remember, what was it that Hobbes said? Unlimited with an asterisk. Why the asterisk for Hobbes?
You only do what you are able to do.
Yeah, it's an unlimited liberty to do what you can do, not just whatever you want to do. Locke puts a slightly different constraint on this. Although I would imagine he would agree with Hobbes that the unlimited liberty of the state of nature isn't the right to make your will manifest magically as if you were a god. That there are going to be natural laws in the sense of scientific natural laws like gravity that say no, you can't do the impossible, the metaphysically impossible or even the physically impossible. But Locke also puts a different constraint on this. It's an unlimited liberty subject to the laws of nature. And note that Hobbes' laws of nature, all 19 of them, which maybe really is only just one law of nature that keeps unpacking itself. But Hobbes' laws of nature were the sorts of things that seem like they didn't make any sense in the state of nature. One ought not hold to the laws of nature in the state of nature because they make you too vulnerable. You have to have this ability to make and keep contracts or compacts or covenants for Hobbes in order for it to even make sense to try to follow those laws of nature. Those laws of nature for Hobbes are the things that drive us out of the state of nature and into civil society. But for Locke, these laws of nature seem to have some purchase in the state of nature as well. That they constrain our actions in the state of nature. Not in the sense of metaphysical necessity, because whatever these laws of nature are going to be, it's entirely possible to violate them. But you will be in the wrong when you do so. And this is the sort of thing that Hobbes kind of foreclosed this possibility. He said there is no justice in the state of nature. There is no right or wrong in the state of nature. There's no property in the state of nature. And Locke is taking a very different approach. This is another big part of the zigging and zagging. And maybe it comes from here, or maybe it just kind of comes from a slightly different sense of what the state of nature is all about. Maybe it comes from a slightly different sense of what the laws of nature are all about. So the state of nature, which has some, it is characterized by an unlimited liberty. But that unlimited liberty is kind of, if we had to describe it, it would be that you're subject to the constraints of the laws of nature, and that's it. Those are the only constraints on you in the state of nature. Which is to say, no authority of any other person. Natural persons in the state of nature are subject to these laws of nature, which seem to be like principles of justice, or something like principles of justice, that work and have application outside of civil society and in the state of nature. And what makes this natural, what the unlimited part of this unlimited liberty, which seems to be severely limited, constrained by the laws of nature, is that there are no other people who have dominion over us. And we get a sense of this as well when Locke gives us another, old familiar. In fact, this is almost note for note. It's like a weird sort of jazz variation on Hobbes. Or I don't know, have you ever seen when people recompose a song in a major or minor key and you're wow, that sounds different, but I can see how it all matches up? We get the same sort of thing going on here. Because in his discussion of the state of nature, Locke notes that everyone's equal in the state of nature. And it's possible to read Hobbes as saying a similar sort of thing to what Locke is saying, but Locke definitely makes it way more explicit. As far as Hobbes was concerned, the rough equality of everybody in the state of nature, what was it based on? Yeah. The ability, physical and mental ability, and it gets cashed out immediately. In fact, this was when we were talking about this, we were oh, that sounds great. Hobbes starts out the chapter 13 of the Leviathan by saying, oh, everybody's roughly equal. And oh, that sounds nice. In physical and mental ability. I don't know if that's true, but if it were, that would sound nice. How do you mean that? Well, we all have the ability to dominate and kill one another. And for Locke, he says everyone's equal, and yes, roughly in physical and mental ability. He kind of like, he goes for that one as well. But the takeaway for Locke on this idea that everyone's equal is that everyone has equal authority. There's an equality of authority in the state of nature such that nobody gets to be my boss. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier, too. We get a slightly different look at the same idea. The only thing that constrains our liberty in the state of nature besides, I suppose, well, not just besides, are the laws of nature. And some of these we can think of as like principles of justice. Some of these we can think of as rational psychological principles for humans. Some of them are presumably going to include like scientific laws as well. Like the physical laws of the universe.
God put someone above us.
Yep. And the evidence that God did not put some of us above others naturally is that we're all roughly equal in ability. And Locke, perhaps thankfully, doesn't immediately go to this idea that that would be the ability because we can all kill one another. It's more this ability that in the state of nature, nobody really gets to tell me what to do. People can try, and they can try to force me into doing their will. But they have no right of dominion over me. And he goes to, Locke will occasionally sprinkle in some kind of theological excursions in this. And here's one of them that we get. We're going to get another one with property, where property starts with the divine providence of everything that we need to enjoy ourselves and benefit and kind of live and thrive. But we get it here with this idea that everyone's equal. And perhaps this is based in the same notion that Hobbes is talking about with a slightly more optimistic spin. It's not about being able to kill one another. It's about maybe an equality in the share of the ability to make decisions for myself, freedom of the will, that sort of thing. Maybe it's physical and mental capability. But it ends up, as far as Locke is concerned, the important takeaway here is that it's equality of authority. In fact, I think somebody maybe even said this when we were talking about Hobbes. They're I think this is what Hobbes means. I think there's way less textual evidence to back up that interpretation of the rough equality amongst all people in the state of nature for Hobbes, but it's explicitly stated in Locke's second treatise. Yeah, Pearson. Yeah, that's a good question. I think he would. I'd have to do a little more work to find out what. Yeah. All the humans are equal. Yeah, equality with, and in fact, Locke says this is what gives all humans no human in the state of nature has dominion over any other human, but this is also why we all have dominion over the animals, the lesser beasts. Given to us by God for our enjoyment. Cue the environmental ethics rant about animal rights and stuff like that. Yes, Jack.
So when he says that we're all equal, both him and Hobbes, does he mean that in a way we know that we're equal because if we weren't equal, there'd be some guy who ruled over everybody? We're all equal, except for Superman. He's way better than you, so don't even try.
Right, yeah. So yeah, he is kind of saying something like that. And he seems to be kind of hanging this on this notion that if you look at the way that God has divvied up ability amongst all the humans, maybe it's about ability, maybe it's about authority, or maybe the two are linked together. That seems the more likely one, that ability and authority seem to come together. And yeah, I think this is what Hobbes is saying. There is no human in the state of nature that is clearly superior and has the right to boss others around. There might be natural sorts of differences between people such that we might hear we might all start to figure out, actually, let's back this up. We're not in the state of nature here in this classroom because there's definitely an authority figure that everybody appeals to. It's me. But if I were to leave the room, then maybe it would be Lord of the Flies, right? It would be state of nature. But as you guys continued to work through Locke's second treatise, which is what I imagine you would do even if I left, My sense is that certain voices would kind of like raise to the forefront of the conversation. Perhaps because they're loud, perhaps because it's like people like to kind of get their elbows into the conversation, and some folks are better at it than others, some folks are shyer. But also, and tell me, like if you've experienced this, sometimes some folks just seem like they know what they're talking about, and we listen to them. This doesn't give them dominion over us. It's not like they have some kind of like authority or political power over us. I voluntarily decide to listen to what they're saying because they seem like they know what they're talking about. And if they ever said something that I was like, that sounds like bullshit, there's no political authority that sweeps in and says something like, it doesn't matter if you get to, like, you don't get to decide whether it's bullshit, they get to decide, right?
What if you're odd?
What do you mean, what if you're odd?
Was it like you're like they have power over you if you're like an odd?
Oh, odd, A-W-E-D, not O-D-D. Yes, you might be in awe of them, but if this is like a freely willed decision, it's not one that's based on political power. It's not one that's based on a right to make laws. And again, we backtrack. Yeah, we could slip back into something fairly Hobbesian, but like Locke leaves us these kind of ledges along the way that we can fall back on and be like, not quite Hobbesian. Equal in authority, which is to say equal in political power. Nobody has dominion over anybody, over any other humans or any other like human persons in the state of nature. And from this, we even get, and Locke goes on a relatively long discussion of this. From this, we even get some kind of notion of something like a golden rule. Locke quotes, I think it's Hooker on this. And gives them a much sunnier kind of version of the golden rule than even Hobbes gave. It does seem to be the sort of thing that's getting much, much closer. And this is also part of the religious sort of, the theological conversation that Locke has introduced into here. So maybe he's just, maybe he's just come from church and he's got the good book on his mind and he's talking about a golden rule where we seem to have some sort of genuine care for other people, not just for ourselves. Although this is tenuous. This is this kind of point that Locke is walking this tightrope in his account of how it is that civil governments come about out of the state of nature. This tightrope between thinking of us as motivated by self-interest versus thinking of us as motivated by a genuine care for others. Corbin? Yeah.
You might have gone over this already, I completely forgot. But,
then it's worth saying again.
what were the implications of the Glorious Revolution?
A king was chased away, not beheaded this time, and a brand new king was brought in. That doesn't happen very often, by the way. That like a whole new line of royalty is brought in, and is brought in from a foreign country, from the Netherlands. That's not as weird as it seems, because there was all kinds of the family trees of the royal families of Europe around this time are just like a nasty tangled mess. Mostly because there's all kinds of marriages between princes and princesses of different kingdoms in order to maintain some sort of alliances, military alliances. Britain manages to keep its nose out of a lot of this. It's not tangled up in things like the 30 Years' War like the rest of Europe is, and perhaps this is, not just perhaps, this is in large part due to geographical things. It's an island far away from the rest of Europe. But an awful lot of the complications of the 30 Years' War are the ways that there are alliances, and even alliances that are based on marriage and family, that get really, really complicated with respect to fights that are going on about religion in Europe at the time. And the similar sorts of things are going on in England, but they're managing to keep more or less to themselves until the Glorious Revolution, when a Dutch king is brought in. Yes?
Charles II and James II were brothers.
Charles II and James II. I said James II. Yeah, I got it all wrong. I'm sorry.
James I was their father, and then James I father was Charles I of England, but also Charles VI of Scotland.
See, it couldn't be any simpler. I'm not even going to try to repeat it for the sake of the people at home. Let's try. So James I was James II and Charles II's father.
Yes, and then Charles I was James I's dad.
All right, so there was Charles I, then James I, and then two sons, James and Charles II, respectively.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And somebody was also the King of Scotland?
Charles the First of England was Charles the Sixth of Scotland.
Charles the First of England was the same person as Charles the Sixth of Scotland. Okay, yeah. Good, good. I'm glad we don't adopt that wacky convention for our leaders here in the United States. It just makes history, like, mind-boggling difficult. Yeah, Amanda.
Was John Locke of the opinion that the new kingdom was superior to the old kingdom?
Yes, he was. And unlike Hobbes, he thought that made a difference. Because for Hobbes, it's like, yeah, the new king might be superior to the old king, but the old king was there first, and that makes like all the difference for like a Hobbesian royalist. And Locke is going to take a very different sort of approach to this. A lot of it's going to have to do with this, these questions of like what it is that civil government is trying to accomplish. We're not really going to get into this today, where the authority of civil government comes from. But a lot of this is going to come down to this question of, does it make sense? Is it ever a good idea? Is it ever legitimate to have a revolution, to throw off the authority of government? And by the way, if you you probably already have some sense of this, but like John Locke is wildly popular amongst the founding fathers of the American Revolution, and perhaps unsurprisingly so. His biggest fan amongst these folks is probably Jefferson. Madison a close second, but like they're all big fans, and it's not surprising. He's giving like a philosophical account of the legitimacy of political revolutions, of throwing off governmental authority and saying like, get out of here, we don't want you anymore, we're going to make our own authority now. Life, liberty, and property, which is the first draft. Jefferson actually does say life, liberty, property first, and then eventually it gets edited to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Interesting question there. Like, why the change? Like, what's the difference? You won't see any discussion of, like, a right to the pursuit of happiness here in Locke, but there will be a discussion of, like, life, liberty, and property, for sure. There was another hand over here. But it went away? Oh, it was? Yeah? Okay. How am I doing on time? We got to get into like war and slavery and property here soon, but we're not quite out of this conversation about the state of nature. I mentioned that unlimited liberty, asterisk, is subject to constraint by the laws of nature. So tell me more about these laws of nature, John Locke. And John Locke says, well, these laws of nature are the limits on our liberty in the state of nature. Well, that's exactly what we said earlier, but maybe it's worth writing down again. These are the limits on infinite liberty in the state of nature. The law part of these laws of nature comes from reason. As a matter of fact, John Locke seems to be talking about it in a sense where we might even assert like a logical identity. That these laws are really no different than laws of reason, or they are dictates of reason. This sounds, again, like this is pretty much what Hobbes was saying, right? His 19 laws of nature were pretty much just dictates of reason. And they amount to two things. It also doesn't sound a whole lot different than what Hobbes was saying. The first of these is don't destroy yourself or your possessions. That possessions part is maybe going to be a little bit different than Hobbes. But Hobbes said one of our rights of nature that kind of gives rise to these laws of nature, one of the rights of nature was a right of self-defense. And here we have this idea that like you ought not act in such a way to destroy yourself in the state of nature. That's very similar to self-defense. Or at least we're going to be able to kind of get one out of the other. And one's possessions, and this is really not all that different than what Hobbes was saying either, but something that comes along with that is don't harm others with respect to their life, liberty, and property. So each of us seems to have some kind of like, according to these laws of nature, which are dictates of reason. Yet again, we had this for Hobbes and we have it again for Locke. that involves something like don't harm yourself and you have some apparent right to self-defense, but also don't harm others. And this is all somehow centered around life, liberty, and property. That these are the things that are trying to be protected by the laws of nature. Unless, proviso, there's something more noble to be gained. And that's an interesting and perhaps an important proviso. That I shouldn't destroy myself or my possessions unless there's something more noble to be gained. Like what? Me? You? God? I don't know. Maybe that's a different question. Can we assume that maybe there are some obvious cases where something is like more noble than something else? Don't destroy yourself or your possessions. There's perhaps some sort of nobility in that. I suppose there's something morally valuable in like my continued existence and my ability to keep my possessions. Would I ever destroy my own possessions? Would that ever make sense? Under what circumstances? Would I ever destroy my own life? Would that ever make sense? Masi? Yeah.
In terms of like overall sense, no, but in the context of why you do it, it could be a mental thing going on. Like it makes
like I could be insane, right? I could take leave of reason and violate the laws of nature and just kill myself. That's one thing, yeah. But Hobbes is not saying that, like, unless you just, like, kind of fail. In that case, Locke seems like he would say something like, you're perhaps not even really quite human. You are maybe just like the mere beasts of the field in this case, if you've taken leave of reason and you're just like, I'm just going to self-harm, like, for no good reason at all. But if I'm sacrificing for something a little bit more noble, I'm surprised nobody's gone here. There are no parents in the room. That's what this is. Nobody here has children. Oh yeah, we have one parent. Like, would you? Oh. Sacrificing yourself to save others might be a case. So Jack was like, who's to say like what counts as more noble? Well, if there's some kind of like moral value in my life, presumably 100 lives are going to be roughly 100 times more valuable. So to sacrifice my own life to save 100 others. It's these two things playing against one another, perhaps, gives us like one clue as to how it is that I might sacrifice for something more noble. I might sacrifice some of my possessions in order to get more possessions, or better possessions, or in order to save my life, or in order to preserve more liberty. I get rid of possessions in order to preserve my liberty all the time. It's heavy to have all those possessions, right? You want to be light and agile. Get rid of all your shit. Yeah, Josh. Office hours, not enough time. But yeah, there's an interesting and very long answer to that. Yeah. Yes, Pearson.
You're not necessarily required to save those people. So like maybe 100 lives are in danger. You're not obligated to give up your life.
Yeah, this is interesting because Locke doesn't cash this out in terms of obligations. It's almost like he's kind of granting permission. That it's like permissible to like violate these laws of nature if you're going to try to exchange for something more noble. But he doesn't like, yeah, well, we should have to like parse the language in order to be like certain about this. But my recollection of it is that he's not talking in terms of obligation. He's talking in terms of permission. The obligation lies here. You have obligation according to like being compelled by reason to follow these laws of nature. But these would kind of represent exceptions, which is like permission to violate those laws. But I don't know, yeah, if it would count as obligation. That's a really interesting point. And yeah, this question of exactly how sunny Locke's portrayal of the state of nature is going to be might hinge on that sort of interpretive question. Yeah, good question. No. Another thing about these laws of nature, which is huge and a huge difference between Locke and Hobbes, is that these laws of nature are enforceable. Well, first of all, they're enforceable. They're enforceable in the state of nature, which is like something that Hobbes seems like he would never agree to. But who would enforce them in the state? Yeah, everyone. And in fact, Locke does an interesting move where he starts off by saying anyone, and he says, well, if it's anyone, then it's also everyone. So each of us in the state of nature can be the arbiter of justice, right? Each of us in the state of nature can enforce these laws of nature. So we can say, like, don't destroy self and possessions. Don't harm others with respect to life, liberty, and property. If somebody does try to harm me with respect to my life, liberty, and property, I can prevent them. I can stop them. I can enforce the law of nature. I can try, at least, right? Hobbes is swinging in from the wings and being like, you can try, but like you might not succeed. But I would be in the right when I did so, right? This is very different than just, for example, preemptive aggression, which Hobbes says this is an inevitable, without the sovereign, this is an inevitable consequence of the state of nature, is a kind of a ramping up of aggression to the point of preemptive aggression. And Locke is going to say, like, no, you can't do that. You can punish others for violating those laws, but only after they've done so. And in fact, Locke says, like, those punishments have to aim towards restitution and restraint. So, like, if somebody's property is taken, I can enforce the laws of nature by making sure they get their property back or something of comparable value. If that property, if it's like, if what you did was you stole my donut and you ate it, like, I don't want my donut back. I want, like, a comparable donut back. Because it's all chewed up now, right? My donut is all chewed up. Yeah, I don't want that. So restitution and restraint. If somebody is currently trying to violate my life, liberty, and property, I can restrain them with force. With deadly force, if necessary. And this is, like enough messing around here. Let's get into that life, liberty, and property stuff, because here we get it, like life, liberty, and property, and these are at work, like a right to life and liberty, and Hobbes is kind of like, yep, life, liberty, that sounds good, and property in the state of nature. Hobbes is going to be like, whoa, tell me more about this right to property in the state of nature. Because when Hobbes describes this, he says that property in the state of nature is not really property, it's just possession. There's mere possession in the state of nature. But there's no right to property such that if somebody takes my stuff, like if I take Corbin's phone, now I have possession of it. And we're in the state of nature. This is mine in the only sense that matters now. But in a civil society, because this is your property, when I take it, it is still yours. You still maintain the property right, and I've done something wrong. And not just in civil society, but in the state of nature as well, as far as Locke is concerned. Two people are holding on to the phone, then there's a question of, like, whose property is it?
Who did the most curls this morning?
Well, that's the Hobbesian state of nature, right? Is like, who's got the most power? But for Locke, it keeps coming back to this question of political power as a right. Like, who has the right to it? Like, we both have the ability to have it. If we're both kind of like fighting over it, we both have the ability to possess it. Maybe we're trying to figure out who's got more ability to possess it, but that's not quite the same as the right to possess it. War, slavery, and property. This is the big trio of life, liberty, and property as it gets discussed by Locke. So, like, this is a good place to go back and read more carefully if you did not read very carefully the first time. Because the stuff that he has, and I'm actually going to run through war and slavery pretty quickly here, but the stuff that he has to say about war and slavery are fascinating. For example, one of the things that he says about slavery is, like, one can't voluntarily submit to slavery. That is not legitimate. I could sign a piece of paper that says I'm your slave now, but that would not be legitimate. I can voluntarily do whatever somebody says just because they ask me to. But that would be voluntary, right? That would not be enslaving me. To enslave me, it would have to be maybe not necessarily against my will, but ignoring my will, right? My will becomes, obsolete, just kind of like irrelevant. The wills of slaves are irrelevant. They're just mere tools. But if I was to willingly make myself a slave, it's not slavery at all. It's what I want to do. And if at any point in like my willingly submitting myself to slavery, I'm just kind of like, I'm done with this, I want to go home now. And the person who I enslaved myself to says like, no, you said you're my slave. Like, as far as Locke is concerned, I think he's got a really good point here. Like, it's just not binding. If there was any legitimacy to it at all, it was because I said that I would be their slave. And now I'm saying that I don't want to be their slave anymore. And so now I get to leave. They can try to subdue me with force, but they have no right to do so. There is no legitimate right to slavery as far as Locke is concerned. This might answer to like some of your questions about race for Locke as well, Pearson, that you were asking about. He's clearly against slavery, for humans at least. And we know that that's the easiest move in the world to make when you're enslaving somebody, is just pretend like they're not actually a human. But at least as far as we're concerned with like just humans, there is no such thing as legitimate slavery. You can submit yourself to drudgery. You can work for a paycheck, but it ain't slavery. War, by the way, the interesting conversation that we get about war for Locke is that it's not synonymous with the state of nature. And Hobbes seemed to indicate that it was synonymous with the state of nature. This was what the state of nature was. It was a war of all against all. And every time a war breaks out, we fall back into the state of nature. This was Hobbes' point about like why civil wars are so awful, because they drag us back into the state of nature, which any reasonable person would want to stay out of. And Locke says, no. War is not synonymous with the state of nature. There are plenty of instances in which you can be engaged in war while you're not in the state of nature. There are plenty of instances in which you can be in the state of nature and not be at war. Because the key to the state of nature, as far as Locke is concerned, is not that we're in a scenario where it's a war of all against all. For Locke, the state of nature is defined by, I'm not subject to anybody else's will. I am only subject to the laws of nature. So I can be in a peaceful, cooperative society with others, and so long as there is no civil authority, as long as like nobody has political authority over anybody else in that community, that is a state of nature that is not a state of war. That's a very big difference between Locke and Hobbes. This is going to be the sort of thing that's going to make it maybe not quite so scary, not so awful to be in the state of nature, which in turn might justify getting rid of a civil government. We wouldn't necessarily fall back into war. We'd fall back in the state of nature, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Because I do have a right to life, liberty, and property, and I can enforce those rights. Anybody can. And it doesn't have to be just me. I don't have to be the one that enforces my own rights to life, liberty, and property. Somebody else can see somebody else picking on me and be like, hey, that ain't right, and step in and fix things. When I took Corbin's phone, Jamie could have been like, hey, don't take that guy's phone. And I'm like, oh, what are you going to do? And then she could subdue me into submission and make me give the phone back. This would be totally legitimate in the state of nature as far as Locke is concerned. And with less than 2 minutes left, I wasn't sure if I could, and then Jack told me to, so I'm gonna go for it. There's this question of so what the heck is a property right such that it exists in the state of nature? If it's gonna it's enforceable by anyone, and this kind of gets us to the enforcement question. Hobbes suggests that there's no such thing as property in the state of nature because you couldn't enforce such a right even if there was one. But now I have this question too of where does the right to property come from in the state of nature? And Hobbes says the very, very fast version of this is, look, I have a right to my life. I also have a right to my liberty. And what is my right to my liberty? My right to my liberty is it more or less the right to do whatever I want? How do I do things? Work? Yeah, I move my body around. I have a right to my right to life and liberty is a right to my own body. And so this is like the most primitive form of property that we can think of. Your body is yours. Not only is your body yours, but if we're going to have any kind of like sensible idea of what liberty is, what I do with my body is my own business. And so it's not just my body, it's what my body does, and my body doing things, this is, or at least one version of my body doing things, is labor. So I own my labor as well. And I own the fruits of my labor. And this is where a property right comes from. In the state of nature or in civil society, this is like a property right no matter where you are for Locke. Property comes from me mixing my labor with the land. And when I do so, everything that yields, the fruits of those labors, are mine just as much as my body was mine. And in fact, in that articulation, we start to see how it is that life, liberty, and property are not three separate things. They are three aspects of one thing, perhaps, and they all kind of collapse on one another. We don't have enough time to talk about it today, so we'll open with this at our next session. But this is also why it will totally make sense to defend your life with lethal force. If somebody is trying to kill you, it perhaps seems reasonable that you could enforce your right to your life with lethal force, right? With a death penalty. Could you kill somebody for trying to enslave you? Locke says, yep. Can you kill somebody for trying to take your property? Do you have a right to? Locke says, yes. That's surprising, by the way. And perhaps when I went to go take Corbin's phone, I was like taking my own life into my hands there. Locke says anybody that would take your property would enslave you. Anybody that would enslave you would kill you. They're all kind of tangled up in one another. And in the state of nature, at least, lethal force is totally justifiable for infractions for any of them. That's where we'll pick up on Thursday.